The message stayed on my kitchen counter long after the rain stopped falling. I did not delete it. I did not answer it. Instead, I left the phone exactly where it was and walked slowly through the house, the same way I had done thousands of mornings before, except this time every room felt slightly different. When you spend nearly 3 decades living inside the same walls, you begin to believe a house remembers things. It remembers laughter echoing down hallways, quiet dinners at the kitchen table, the sound of a child running up the stairs after school. Our son, Daniel, used to leave his backpack by the front door every afternoon even though I asked him 100 times to put it away. Richard would come home from work, loosen his tie, and pretend to complain about the noise while secretly smiling. I paused at the living room doorway and looked at the sofa where Richard used to sit every evening at 6 o'clock sharp to watch the news. The indentation in the cushion was still there. A familiar shape, like a memory that had not yet realized it had been abandoned. I folded my arms and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. It is strange how silence changes meaning. Sometimes silence feels peaceful. Other times it feels like a question waiting for an answer. But that morning I did not feel confused. I felt observant. Because when something large breaks in your life, you begin to look backward, carefully examining the small cracks that were always there but went unnoticed. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom and opened the closet door. Richard's side still held his neatly arranged shirts and jackets, each one spaced carefully on the rack the way he preferred. He had always been particular about order. His gray travel bag sat on the top shelf where he had left it the night before. I remembered how casually he had packed for the trip. No excitement. No conversation about the beach or the restaurants we might visit. Just a quiet routine, as if the anniversary trip had already stopped mattering. I reached up and touched the bag for a moment before lowering my hand again. There was no anger in the gesture. Just confirmation. The name from the message returned to my mind. Lena. I had heard Richard mention her a few months earlier. He said she helped coordinate marketing contracts for one of the consulting projects he occasionally advised on. He had described her as organized and efficient, which at the time sounded like a compliment any business associate might receive. But now the name carried a different weight. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the table where the morning light had begun to replace the gray drizzle outside. My coffee had gone cold. I took another sip anyway. The taste was bitter, but it helped me think. Over the past year there had been other small details. Richard started staying out later on Thursdays, saying he was meeting old colleagues for dinner. His phone rang more often in the evenings, and he would step onto the porch before answering. Once, a receipt from a restaurant in Bellevue slipped out of his coat pocket when I was hanging it up in the hallway. 2 dinners. 2 glasses of wine. A place we had never visited together. At the time I had simply placed the receipt back in his pocket and continued with my evening. Marriage teaches you patience. But patience can also disguise avoidance. I pushed the mug slightly across the table and stared at the quiet room around me. Outside, the rain had completely stopped now, leaving the garden shining under a thin layer of water. The roses Richard planted were bright red against the green leaves, each one carefully pruned the way he liked them. He used to say a garden only grows properly when someone is paying attention. That thought stayed with me for a moment. Because attention is exactly what had been missing lately. I stood up and rinsed my mug in the sink before drying my hands on the small blue towel hanging from the cabinet handle. The routine felt familiar and steady, and I appreciated that. Some habits remain reliable even when people do not. Then I walked back to the counter and picked up my phone again, reading the message for the 3rd time. I am taking Lena instead. Do not wait up. The sentence was almost polite in its simplicity. As if replacing a wife of 40 years with another woman was just a scheduling adjustment. I turned the phone over and placed it face down on the counter. There was no need to look at it anymore. What mattered was not the message itself, but what it revealed about the man who had sent it. I glanced toward the calendar hanging on the refrigerator door. The date was circled in blue ink. 40 years of marriage. I had written the number myself 2 weeks earlier with a small smile, thinking about how few couples actually reach that milestone. I walked over and removed the magnet holding the calendar page in place. For a second I considered tearing the paper in half, but that felt unnecessary. Instead I simply turned the page forward to the next month. The motion was small and quiet. A simple shift in time. Then I returned to the table and sat down again, folding my hands together while looking out the window toward the wet garden. A question slowly formed in my mind, not emotional, not dramatic, just practical. If Richard had already chosen to leave our life behind, what exactly was he expecting to come back to? Because while he was somewhere on a plane heading toward California with a woman named Lena, the house he had left behind was still here in Seattle. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. The property value had doubled since we bought it. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, every cabinet and floorboard existed because I had helped build this life alongside him. I leaned back in the chair and allowed a slow breath to leave my lungs. For the first time since reading the message, I felt something close to certainty. Richard believed he had made a final decision about our future with one short sentence on a phone screen. But decisions, I had learned after 67 years of living, do not truly exist until someone acts on them. And as the morning sunlight finally broke through the clouds and spilled across the kitchen floor, I realized something important. Richard Whitmore had walked out of this house believing he understood exactly how the rest of this story would unfold. What he did not know was that the next chapter had already begun the moment he pressed send. The house felt unusually large that afternoon, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound noticeable. I moved slowly from room to room, not searching for anything in particular, just observing the place that had been the center of my life for nearly 30 years. When you realize that something familiar is about to change, you begin to look at ordinary things more carefully. The hallway picture frames caught my attention first. There was the photograph from our 25th anniversary dinner, taken at a small restaurant near Lake Union. Richard had insisted we sit by the window because he liked watching the boats pass by in the evening light. In the picture he was smiling in the relaxed way he used to smile back then, one arm resting behind my chair. I studied the photograph for a moment, not with sadness but with curiosity, the way someone studies an old map that once guided them somewhere important. I continued down the hallway until I reached the small home office Richard used to use when he began consulting after retirement. The desk was neat, as always. Richard believed paperwork should be organized even if the work itself was casual. His laptop sat closed in the center of the desk, and beside it was a stack of folders labeled with careful handwriting. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the bookshelf he installed years ago. I sat down slowly in the chair across from his desk and looked around the space that had quietly become the center of his life during the past year. This was where the changes had started. The consulting projects had sounded harmless enough when he first mentioned them. A few old colleagues needed advice about construction management, he said. Nothing demanding. Just occasional meetings and phone calls. At the time it had seemed like a good thing. Retirement can be difficult for men who have spent decades building companies and solving problems. Work gives structure to the day. But as the months passed, the consulting became more frequent. The phone calls stretched longer. The dinners with colleagues happened more often, always on Thursdays. I reached forward and opened the top drawer of the desk, mostly out of habit rather than suspicion. Inside were the usual things: pens, notepads, a calculator, and a few neatly folded receipts held together with a small metal clip. I lifted the receipts and glanced through them. Restaurants in Bellevue. Parking garages downtown. A small hotel near the waterfront. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary transactions that formed the outline of a life lived somewhere slightly different from the one we shared. I placed the receipts back in the drawer and closed it gently. Then I opened the laptop. The screen woke immediately, and for a moment I expected to see the familiar company spreadsheets Richard often worked on. Instead, the screen displayed a calendar. Several entries were highlighted in blue across the past few months. Consulting meetings. Lunch appointments. Travel reminders. I studied the dates quietly. Patterns have a way of revealing themselves when you stop trying to ignore them. Most of the meetings were scheduled on Thursdays or Fridays. Many were in Bellevue, a city about 10 miles east of Seattle across Lake Washington. It is a pleasant place with new office buildings and quiet restaurants, the kind of city where people conduct business and return home before sunset. One particular entry caught my attention because it appeared repeatedly every 2 weeks. Lunch with Lena. The words were typed simply, without explanation, as if the meaning was obvious. I leaned back in the chair and allowed the quiet of the room to settle around me again. Outside the office window I could see the backyard garden shining under the afternoon sunlight that had finally replaced the morning rain. The roses Richard planted were open now, their petals bright against the green leaves. I remembered the afternoon he first dug those holes in the soil nearly 15 years ago. He had spent hours measuring the spacing between each plant because he wanted them to grow evenly along the fence line. Back then I thought it was charming how seriously he approached something as simple as a garden. Now I wondered if that careful attention had slowly shifted somewhere else. I closed the laptop and stood up from the chair. There was no need to search further. The story had already explained itself. Richard had not simply made a sudden decision this morning. The decision had been growing quietly for months, perhaps even longer, hidden inside business lunches and consulting meetings and Thursday dinners that lasted a little too long. I walked back into the hallway and paused beside the photograph wall again. The younger version of us smiled from behind the glass frames, unaware of the distance that time would eventually place between those moments and this one. For a brief second I imagined what Richard might be doing at that exact moment somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, sitting beside a woman whose name had appeared so casually on his calendar. Perhaps he believed he had left his old life behind with a single message sent from an airport gate. But life rarely changes that easily. Because while he was flying south toward California sunlight, I was standing inside the house that represented 4 decades of shared effort and sacrifice. The floors we refinished together. The mortgage payments we made month after month. The kitchen we remodeled the year Daniel started college. Every inch of the place carried a quiet record of the life we had built side by side. I walked slowly toward the kitchen again and stopped beside the large window that looked out over the backyard. The garden was completely still now, the earlier rain nothing more than a memory on the leaves. For the first time since reading Richard's message that morning, I allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. Because something had become clear while I sat in that office looking at his calendar. Richard Whitmore believed he had walked away from a marriage this morning. What he did not seem to understand was that he had also walked away from a house, a history, and a future that he no longer had any control over. And as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floorboards of the kitchen, I realized that the next step in this story was no longer his decision to make. I spent the rest of that afternoon moving through the house slowly, not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because clarity sometimes arrives in quiet layers rather than sudden decisions. By early evening the Seattle sky had turned the pale silver color it often does before sunset, and the long shadows from the maple trees in our backyard stretched across the lawn Richard once mowed every Saturday morning without fail. I stood at the kitchen counter again, looking out the window, thinking about something my father used to say when I was young. He believed that every house has a story written inside its walls, but the ownership of that story belongs to the person who protects it. At the time I never understood exactly what he meant. Now, standing in the house Richard and I had purchased together nearly 3 decades earlier, the meaning seemed much clearer. I walked back into the hallway and opened the small cabinet near the staircase where we kept important documents. Most families have a place like that somewhere in their home. Insurance papers, tax returns, old warranties for appliances that stopped working years ago. I pulled the small gray file box from the shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. The box was heavier than it looked, filled with decades of paperwork neatly organized in labeled folders. Richard liked to believe he handled most of our finances, but the truth was that organization had always been my strength. I sat down in the chair by the window and opened the lid. The first folder held our mortgage documents from the year we bought the house. I remembered the day clearly. It was late spring, and the real estate market in Seattle had just begun to climb. Richard had been excited about the backyard because it was large enough for the garden he always wanted to build. I had been more practical, checking the inspection reports and making sure the foundation was solid. We signed the paperwork together in a small office downtown while a young title clerk explained the details. At the time the numbers seemed enormous. Now the mortgage had been paid off for nearly 8 years. I flipped through the pages slowly until I reached the final documents. The property deed rested neatly behind a clear plastic sleeve. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the table. The paper had that faint official smell that legal documents always carry. The name printed across the ownership line was mine. Margaret Whitmore. That had not been an accident. The down payment on the house came from an inheritance my mother left me after she passed away. At the time the lawyer suggested placing the title under my name for simplicity, especially since Richard already had several business assets connected to his construction company. It had seemed like a practical decision rather than an important one. Richard never objected. We were married. Everything belonged to both of us in spirit, even if the paperwork said otherwise. I traced my finger lightly along the printed letters of my name, remembering the quiet confidence my mother always carried in her voice when she spoke about protecting what you build. She grew up during years when women did not always control their own finances, and she believed strongly that independence mattered. When she left me that inheritance, she said something simple that stayed with me ever since. Use it to build something stable. At the time I believed that stability meant a house where a family could grow together. For many years that belief proved true. But stability can take different forms as time moves forward. I placed the deed back into the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the late afternoon sunlight warm the kitchen floor. The quiet house no longer felt uncertain. Instead it felt steady, as if it understood that something important had shifted. Richard was somewhere in California by now, probably walking along a beach with a woman whose name had appeared so casually in his calendar. Perhaps he believed that the life he left behind would simply remain waiting for him to return whenever it was convenient. But life does not pause so easily. I closed the gray file box and set it gently aside. Then I stood up and walked over to the kitchen sink, filling a glass with cold water before taking a slow sip. The air in the house felt lighter than it had that morning. Clear decisions have a way of doing that. I looked out the window once more toward the quiet backyard garden and allowed myself another thoughtful smile. Richard Whitmore had spent the last year carefully constructing a second life he thought I did not see. What he did not realize was that the foundation of the first life had always been stronger than he understood. And foundations, when they belong to the right person, give you options. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees and the kitchen filled with the warm color of evening light, a simple idea formed in my mind with the calm certainty that sometimes appears when the path forward finally becomes visible. If Richard had already decided he no longer wanted the life we built together, then perhaps it was time for that life to belong entirely to the person who had quietly protected it all along. I slept well that night, which surprised me more than anything else. After 40 years of marriage, you might expect a woman to lie awake replaying every memory and every mistake, wondering where things went wrong. But my mind felt unusually calm. Perhaps it was because the moment of uncertainty had already passed. When someone shows you exactly who they are, there is a certain peace in finally believing them. The next morning the Seattle sky was clear and pale blue, the kind of quiet spring morning that makes the neighborhood feel almost suspended in time. I woke up at 6:30, the same way I always did, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The house felt different again, but this time the difference was not heavy. It felt organized. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite white mug, and sat at the kitchen table with the gray file box still resting beside me from the night before. The property deed remained inside the folder exactly where I had placed it. Margaret Whitmore, sole owner. I looked at the document again, not because I doubted it, but because it represented something larger than a piece of paper. It represented a quiet advantage Richard had never really thought about. I took a slow sip of coffee and considered the possibilities carefully. Selling a house is not something most people decide to do in a single morning. It requires planning, paperwork, inspections, agents, and signatures. But Seattle real estate had changed dramatically over the past decade. Houses in our neighborhood often sold within days, sometimes hours, especially ones with a garden and a quiet street like ours. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where our laptop usually sat. I opened it and typed the name of a real estate agent I had met 2 years earlier at a neighborhood event. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. She specialized in properties in our area and had mentioned more than once how desirable the neighborhood had become for young families moving into the city. Her number appeared on the screen within seconds. I paused before dialing, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to phrase the conversation carefully. When Rebecca answered, her voice sounded bright and professional. I introduced myself and mentioned that we had met briefly at a community fundraiser. Then I asked a simple question. If someone wanted to sell a house quickly in this neighborhood, how fast could it realistically happen? Rebecca laughed softly in the way experienced professionals sometimes do when they hear a question they already know the answer to. She told me that homes like mine often received multiple offers within a week. Sometimes faster if the listing was priced strategically. She asked if I was thinking about downsizing. I told her I was considering a change and would like an estimate of the property value. She offered to stop by that afternoon. After I ended the call, I closed the laptop and looked around the living room again. The morning sunlight poured through the large front windows, illuminating the hardwood floors Richard and I refinished together nearly 15 years ago. I remembered sanding those boards side by side on a warm July weekend, laughing about how much work home improvement really required. At the time we both believed we were investing in something permanent. But permanence, I had learned, is often an illusion created by habit. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon Rebecca Lawson pulled into the driveway in a silver sedan. She walked through the house slowly, making notes on a tablet while complimenting the garden and the natural light in the kitchen. When we reached the backyard she paused beside the rose bushes Richard had planted years earlier and said something that stayed with me. Houses with gardens like this do not stay on the market long. I thanked her and asked what price range she believed would attract serious buyers immediately. She explained the current market conditions carefully, mentioning that several families had been searching for homes exactly like this one. After a few more minutes she looked at me and asked if my husband would be joining the decision. I shook my head gently and explained that the property was listed solely under my name and that I was comfortable moving forward independently. Rebecca did not appear surprised. In her profession she had likely seen many different versions of family transitions. She simply nodded and said that if I wanted the house listed quickly, she could arrange photographs and paperwork within the next 48 hours. I walked her to the front door and watched as she drove away down the quiet street lined with tall maple trees. Then I returned to the kitchen and poured another cup of coffee, standing by the window while looking out at the backyard garden one more time. Somewhere several hundred miles south, Richard Whitmore was likely enjoying the California sunshine with a woman who believed she was stepping into a comfortable future. What neither of them understood yet was that the foundation of that future had always depended on something far more solid than a plane ticket and a text message. And as the afternoon sun settled warmly across the kitchen floor, I realized with calm certainty that the next step was already in motion. I woke up early again the next morning, not because I had to, but because my mind had already settled into a quiet rhythm of decisions. The sky outside the bedroom window was pale and clear, the kind of calm Seattle morning that makes the neighborhood look almost untouched. For the first time in many years, I realized something unusual. The house did not feel like a shared space anymore. It felt like mine. I walked downstairs slowly, passing the framed photographs along the hallway wall again. The same memories were there, the same smiling faces from birthdays and holidays, but the meaning behind them had shifted slightly. Memory does not disappear when life changes. It simply becomes part of the background. In the kitchen I brewed coffee and stood by the window while the machine finished its quiet work. The backyard garden looked especially bright in the morning sunlight. The roses Richard had planted were fully open now, their red petals catching the light like small lanterns against the fence line. I wondered briefly if he would notice they were blooming when he came back. Then I remembered that noticing things had not been his habit lately. I poured my coffee and sat at the table with my laptop open in front of me. Rebecca Lawson had already sent the preliminary listing documents by email late the night before. She worked quickly, which I appreciated. The message included a short note explaining that the photographer could arrive later that afternoon if the house was ready. I read through the documents carefully, line by line, the way I always had with important paperwork. Years ago Richard used to tease me about reading contracts too slowly. He preferred to trust the process and move forward quickly. I preferred to understand every word before signing anything. That difference in our personalities had never seemed important before. Now it felt like preparation. The listing price Rebecca recommended was higher than I expected, but the explanation made sense. Seattle property values had climbed steadily over the last decade. Especially in neighborhoods like ours where the streets were quiet and the schools had strong reputations. Families moving into the city often searched for houses exactly like this one. I closed the laptop for a moment and looked around the kitchen again. The cabinets were still the soft maple color we chose during the renovation 15 years earlier. The large window above the sink framed the garden perfectly. A young couple could easily imagine raising children here. I stood up and walked through the house slowly, noticing details the way a visitor might. The living room felt open and bright in the morning light. The hardwood floors were smooth and warm under my feet. The staircase curved gently toward the second floor where the bedrooms sat quietly behind closed doors. Each room carried echoes of our life together, but none of them felt heavy anymore. Instead they felt complete, as if the house itself understood that its story was ready for a new chapter. Around noon Rebecca arrived again, this time with a photographer carrying a camera bag and a small set of lighting equipment. They moved efficiently from room to room, opening curtains and adjusting angles to capture the natural light. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, answering a few simple questions about the age of the roof and the date of the last plumbing inspection. At one point Rebecca paused near the dining room window and looked at the garden outside. She smiled and said that buyers always notice a well-cared-for yard. I told her Richard had spent many weekends tending those roses. The words sounded neutral when I said them, which surprised me slightly. But it was true. People can contribute to something meaningful even if they do not stay long enough to protect it. After the photographer finished, Rebecca explained that the listing would go live the following morning. She expected interest immediately. Houses in our area rarely stayed available for long. When she left the driveway again that afternoon, the house felt quieter than ever before, but also lighter. I walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee once more. Somewhere in California, Richard Whitmore was probably enjoying warm sunshine and ocean air with a woman who believed she was stepping into a comfortable future. He might even have been planning how to explain his absence when he returned home. Perhaps he assumed the house would look exactly the same as when he left it, waiting patiently for his arrival. I took a slow sip of coffee and allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile as the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. Because by the time Richard's plane eventually carried him back to Seattle, the story he believed he was returning to would no longer exist. The listing went live early the next morning, just as Rebecca had promised. I woke before the sun fully rose and walked downstairs to the kitchen where the quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee grounds, and the backyard garden outside the window was covered in a thin layer of morning mist. I poured a cup of coffee and opened my laptop on the kitchen table. Rebecca had sent a short message just after 7 o'clock confirming that the house was now officially on the market. Beneath her message was a link to the listing. I clicked it and waited while the page loaded slowly. When the photographs appeared, I almost did not recognize the house. The photographer had captured the light in a way that made every room look bright and welcoming. The living room windows reflected the garden outside, the staircase curved elegantly toward the second floor, and the kitchen looked warm and inviting in the morning light. It was the same house I had walked through thousands of times, but seeing it through someone else's eyes gave it a new perspective. A place where another family could begin something. I closed the laptop after a moment and sat quietly with my coffee. I did not feel nervous about the listing. Instead I felt curious. Rebecca had said houses like this rarely stayed available long. Around 9:30 that morning my phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a message from Rebecca. She wrote that 2 buyers had already requested showings later that afternoon. I smiled slightly and set the phone down again. Interest that quickly confirmed what she had explained about the market. Families were searching for homes like this one, especially in neighborhoods where the streets were quiet and the schools nearby had strong reputations. I spent the late morning walking through the house one more time, straightening small details the way I used to do before guests arrived for dinner parties years ago. I adjusted a lamp in the living room so the light fell gently across the hardwood floor. I folded a soft blanket over the back of the sofa. In the kitchen I wiped the countertop until the granite surface reflected the sunlight from the window. These small gestures were not about nostalgia. They were about respect. The house had been good to us for many years. It deserved to look its best before welcoming someone new. Shortly after 2 o'clock the first couple arrived with Rebecca. They looked to be in their early 30s, the kind of quiet excitement in their voices that people often have when imagining their future somewhere. I greeted them politely and stepped outside onto the back patio to give them space to explore. From the garden I could hear the soft echo of their footsteps moving from room to room. Occasionally Rebecca's voice drifted through an open window as she described the age of the roof or the details of the kitchen renovation. I walked slowly along the fence line where the roses were blooming brightly under the afternoon sun. The garden felt peaceful, almost proud of its careful design. Richard had planted those roses with patience, measuring the spacing between each bush so they would grow evenly. For a moment I appreciated the memory without resentment. Life is rarely defined by a single action. Even people who eventually leave a story have chapters worth remembering. After about 20 minutes the couple stepped outside into the garden where I was standing. They thanked me for allowing them to view the property and complimented the yard. The woman said she could imagine children playing in the grass while her husband grilled dinner on the patio. I nodded politely and told them the garden had always been my favorite part of the house. They smiled and walked back toward the driveway where Rebecca waited beside her car. Not long after they left, another family arrived. Then another. By early evening Rebecca returned alone and sat with me at the kitchen table while the soft orange light of sunset filled the room. She placed her tablet on the table and showed me the first official offer that had come in from the young couple who visited earlier. The number on the screen was slightly higher than the listing price. She explained that in competitive markets buyers often moved quickly to secure homes they liked. I read through the details carefully, just as I had done with every important document throughout my life. The offer included a short inspection period and a closing timeline of less than 30 days. Rebecca looked at me and asked calmly if I would like to accept it or wait for other potential offers. I thought for a moment while the evening sunlight faded slowly outside the window. Somewhere far to the south, Richard Whitmore was likely finishing another pleasant day along the California coast with a woman who believed she was stepping into a comfortable life beside him. He probably assumed that when he returned to Seattle, the familiar house on this quiet street would still be waiting exactly as he left it. I looked back at the tablet on the table and then toward the backyard garden glowing softly in the last light of the day. Some decisions require long consideration. Others arrive quietly when the moment is right. I reached for the stylus Rebecca handed me and signed my name across the acceptance line with steady handwriting. Margaret Whitmore. The ink dried quickly under the warm kitchen light. Rebecca smiled and began preparing the next steps of the process while I leaned back in my chair, listening to the evening sounds of the neighborhood outside. The house was no longer just a memory of 40 years. It was now a promise to someone else. And by the time Richard's plane eventually carried him back to Seattle, the place he believed he still lived would belong to an entirely different future. I woke before sunrise on the morning Rebecca told me the paperwork would be finalized. The house was quiet in that familiar early hour when the entire neighborhood still seemed to be asleep. The air felt calm and cool, and a faint gray light rested over the backyard garden beyond the kitchen window. I brewed coffee slowly and sat at the table where I had spent so many mornings over the years planning grocery lists, holiday dinners, and family visits. Now the same table held a thin stack of documents Rebecca had delivered the evening before. Closing papers. Transfer confirmations. Numbers and signatures that quietly turned decades of ownership into a completed transaction. I read through the pages. Once more, not because I doubted them but because I respected the finality of the moment. The buyer's family was scheduled to complete the transfer later that afternoon. By the end of the day the house would legally belong to them. I took a sip of coffee and looked around the kitchen again, allowing the memory of ordinary mornings to settle briefly in my mind. The maple cabinets, the polished granite counter, the large window framing the garden. Nothing about the room looked different, yet everything about it had changed. After breakfast I walked upstairs and opened the closet in the master bedroom. Richard's jackets still hung neatly along the rack, exactly where he left them the morning he flew to California. I stood there quietly for a moment before reaching for one of the empty boxes Rebecca had suggested I keep nearby. I folded each jacket carefully and placed them inside without rushing. It was not an act of anger. It was simply organization. The rest of the house followed the same pattern throughout the morning. I sorted belongings calmly, separating what I intended to take with me from what belonged to Richard. By noon the boxes were stacked neatly in the corner of the living room beside the staircase. Outside the sky had brightened into a clear blue, and the roses in the garden swayed gently in the breeze. Around 1 o'clock Rebecca arrived with the final documents and a calm smile that told me everything had gone smoothly on the buyer's side. We sat at the kitchen table where the sunlight streamed across the surface, and she explained the final transfer timeline carefully. The funds would be released into my account before the evening. The buyers planned to begin moving their furniture within the next week. I signed the last document with steady handwriting, the same way I had signed my name on the offer acceptance 2 days earlier. Margaret Whitmore. Rebecca congratulated me quietly, though the word did not feel necessary. Some transitions are not celebrations. They are simply conclusions. After she left I walked through the house one more time, pausing briefly in each room. The living room where Daniel used to build toy train tracks across the carpet. The small office where Richard spent so many evenings talking about consulting projects. The upstairs bedroom where the morning light always arrived first through the east-facing window. Every space held a piece of the past, but none of them felt unfinished. By late afternoon I carried the last small suitcase down the stairs and placed it beside the front door. My car waited quietly in the driveway under the shade of the tall maple tree Richard planted many years ago. I locked the front door behind me and stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the quiet street. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Children's bicycles rested beside driveways. A neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk. Life continued calmly, unaware of the quiet transformation that had just taken place inside the house behind me. Before leaving I reached into my purse and removed a small envelope I had prepared earlier that morning. Inside was a simple note and a copy of the final property transfer confirmation. I walked back up the porch steps and slipped the envelope carefully through the narrow slot in the front door mail opening. It landed softly on the hardwood floor just inside the entryway. I did not need to imagine Richard's expression when he eventually returned to Seattle and stepped through that door. Some realizations explain themselves. I walked down the porch steps again and opened the car door, placing my suitcase in the passenger seat beside me. The engine started with a quiet hum, and I backed slowly out of the driveway one last time. As I drove down the street I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house growing smaller behind me, framed by the same maple trees that had shaded it for decades. Somewhere far to the south, Richard Whitmore was probably finishing another pleasant day under the California sun, unaware that the life he believed he would return to had already disappeared. By the time his plane eventually touched down in Seattle, the front door key in his pocket would open a house that no longer belonged to him. And the story he thought he had walked away from would already be finished. The highway stretched quietly ahead of me as I drove south away from the neighborhood that had been my home for nearly 3 decades. The late afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, casting long golden lines across the road while the Seattle skyline slowly faded behind me in the rearview mirror. I had not planned exactly where I would go next when I left the house that morning, but I had reserved a small furnished apartment overlooking Lake Washington 2 days earlier, just after Rebecca confirmed that the buyers were ready to move forward. It was a temporary place, nothing elaborate, but it had large windows facing the water and a small balcony where the evening light reflected across the lake. As I drove, I thought about how strange it felt that such a large chapter of my life had closed so quietly. There had been no dramatic arguments, no raised voices, no scenes that would make neighbors pause outside their windows. Instead, there had only been a message on a phone screen and a series of calm decisions that followed. By the time I reached the apartment building, the sky had turned a soft amber color, and the lake looked smooth and glassy beneath the evening light. I parked the car and carried my small suitcase inside, taking the elevator to the third floor where the apartment door opened onto a quiet hallway. Inside, the space was simple but welcoming. A small living room faced the balcony doors, and beyond the glass the water stretched out toward the distant hills. I placed my suitcase near the sofa and stepped outside onto the balcony, resting my hands lightly against the railing. The air smelled fresh, carrying the cool scent of the lake and the faint sound of boats moving slowly across the water. For the first time in many years, I felt something that had been missing for a long time without my noticing. Space. Not emptiness, but space to think clearly about what the next part of life might look like. I remained there for several minutes watching the sunlight disappear behind the hills before returning inside and placing my phone on the small table beside the couch. There were 2 new messages waiting. One was from Rebecca confirming that the property funds had been transferred successfully into my account. The other was from Richard. His message had arrived less than an hour earlier. The screen displayed his name in the familiar way it had for decades, but the words beneath it looked strangely distant. He wrote that his flight would land in Seattle later that evening and asked if I could pick him up from the airport because his car was still in the driveway at home. I read the message once and set the phone down again without answering immediately. Outside, the lake had turned deep blue under the fading sky, and small lights from boats and distant houses reflected gently on the water. I walked into the kitchen area of the apartment and poured a glass of cold water, then returned to the balcony with the glass in my hand. Somewhere above the clouds, Richard Whitmore was likely finishing his flight back from California, perhaps expecting to step through the familiar front door of the house he had left behind just a few days earlier. He would probably imagine the roses blooming in the garden, the kitchen light glowing softly over the counter, and the quiet comfort of a place he believed would always be waiting for him. I took a slow sip of water and allowed a small thoughtful smile to appear as the evening breeze moved across the lake. Then I walked back inside and picked up my phone again. This time I opened Richard's message and typed a short reply, choosing my words carefully but calmly. I told him that the house had been sold while he was away and that the documents explaining everything were waiting for him just inside the front door where I had left them. I added that the boxes in the living room contained the belongings he had left behind and that he could arrange to collect them whenever it was convenient. For a moment I looked at the message before pressing send, not out of hesitation but simply because it marked the final step of a story that had quietly unfolded over the past few days. Then I placed the phone back on the table and stepped outside onto the balcony again. The lake was almost dark now, the surface reflecting only the scattered lights of distant homes along the shore. Somewhere in the city an airplane passed overhead, descending slowly toward the airport where Richard's flight would soon arrive. I leaned against the railing and looked out across the water, feeling the cool evening air move gently around me. 40 years earlier I had believed that building a stable home meant holding on to something forever. Now I understood that stability sometimes means knowing exactly when it is time to let go. And as the last color of sunset faded from the sky above Lake Washington, the quiet of the evening felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of a life that finally belonged entirely to me.